Hello, and welcome to Total Training's Adobe Photoshop CS5 Extended Advanced Series. I'm Amadou Diallo. I'm a photographer, author, educator, and digital imaging consultant. But most importantly, I'm your guide to the wonderful world of Photoshop CS5. In this series, we're going to explore the advanced tools and techniques that professionals use to create Photoshop masterpieces. I'll show you how to make short work of even the most challenging editing tasks. And because I'll be using images that are available for you to download, you can follow along every step of the way. We've got a lot to look forward to over the next several hours. At the end of this training, you'll be able to create impressive results in the most efficient manner possible. You'll also learn how to take full advantage of brand new features introduced in Photoshop CS5. Let's get started by configuring our preferences, settings, and workspace.
Working efficiently in Photoshop requires a bit of tweaking before we even open up an image. Now, we do have the ability to configure much of Photoshop's behavior via preferences. I'm going to begin this lesson with my preferences set to their factory defaults, and I'd like for you to do the same. So the very first thing that I want you to do is quit Photoshop if it's already running. Then, if you're on a Mac, hold down the Option-Command-Shift keys. On Windows, that would be Alt-Control-Shift while launching Photoshop. That brings up the "Do you really want to do this?" dialog box. Yes, we do want to delete the Adobe Photoshop settings file, so we'll simply click Yes. I should point out that deleting your preferences is also a great troubleshooting step. If Photoshop starts acting strangely, crashing repeatedly, quitting unexpectedly, or simply exhibiting just plain weird behavior, one of the first steps of troubleshooting is to delete your preferences and restart Photoshop, as we have just done. Now we've got Photoshop in its default state, and we're going to go up to the Preferences menu. On a Mac, that's under the Photoshop menu, Preferences. If you're on Windows, that would be under the Edit menu. Or you can simply use the keyboard shortcut Command-K on a Mac, Control-K on a PC. And let's begin with the General pane. Here, I do want to point out the HUD color picker, because this is brand new to CS5. We have a new and much more efficient way to choose colors. I'll just show you the options here. We're going to go into this in great detail in an upcoming lesson, but I want you to see that we can choose between hue strips and hue wheels and different sizes of those. We're going to leave this at the default right now. And let's look at image interpolation. The choices I want you to really pay attention to here are the bicubic options. Now, if you resize images a lot, the thing you want to ask yourself at this point is, do I typically downsample my images? Do I make my images smaller? If you do that, you want to choose this bicubic sharper option. Choosing this option means that whenever you go to the image size dialog box and check the resample box, bicubic sharper will be automatically selected as your interpolation method. On the other hand, if you find yourself most often enlarging images, you want to choose bicubic smoother here. That way, when you pull up the image size dialog box and check the resample box, bicubic smoother will be your default option. This way, this choice will automatically be made for you whenever you go to the image size dialog box and check the resample button. I'm going to set mine to bicubic sharper here because we're going to be downsampling some images in this training. Let's go down here under Options. Use Shift key for tool switch. Turn that off, off, off. One of the biggest time wasters in Photoshop. Basically, if you have a tool and you want to switch to another group tool or hidden tool, turning this off allows you to simply press the keyboard shortcut. If you're in the rectangular marquee tool and you want to go to the elliptical marquee, you just have to press M. If you keep this option on, you'll have to press Shift M. So you'll find it to be a huge time saver if you only have to press one key on the keyboard to move between group tools. We'll go down here. We have Enable Flick Panning. This was a feature introduced in CS4. Now, if you like to be able to flick the image with the mouse and have it continue scrolling past your eyes, by all means leave this on. If, like me, you find it a bit disturbing, let's turn it off. And I just want to say a few words about the history log if you're not familiar with it. This option, turning it on, allows you to record information about everything that you've done editing-wise to your images in Photoshop. You could choose to save that information as metadata that's saved with the file. You could save that information as a text file, or you could choose both options. Now, this history log isn't something that you can click through and move backwards through history states. It's simply a list of what you have done in Photoshop. You could restrict that list to individual Photoshop sessions, or you could create one ongoing list that records everything from the time you set this preference in Photoshop until you turn this off back in the Preferences panel. But the option is there. We're not going to be using that in this training, but it is something to be aware of if you need a record of the work that you've done in Photoshop. Let's move on down to Interface and Show Menu Colors. For advanced Photoshop users, this is more of an annoyance than anything else, and you definitely don't want to have extraneous colors on your screen when you're doing color critical work, so let's turn that off. Show Tooltips is generally a very good thing to have. For this training, though, I'm going to be your walking, talking tooltip guide, so let's turn those off here. If you're working on a Mac, you're going to see an Enable Gestures option here. This will allow you, if you're using a trackpad, to pinch, rotate, and use all these very cool multi-finger gestures. But we're going to be working on a desktop machine without a trackpad, so I'm going to deselect this option. And now under Panels and Documents, we have this Open Documents as Tabs option here. This feature was introduced in CS4, and the response from the Photoshop community was, to be polite, quite mixed. Some people loved it, some people hated it. With this option checked, when you open multiple documents, they will all be contained within a single window, differentiated by tabs. With this option off, you'll get the previous behavior in Photoshop where multiple documents would each open up in individual windows. If you prefer the old behavior in Photoshop, turn this off. For this training, we're going to leave this on because we are going to do some work with tabs, so we're going to leave that just where it is. And let's go down to file handling here. There's something I want you to take a look at. We've got this Save As to Original Folder option here. Now, if we keep this checkbox on, if we have a file in Photoshop and we go to File, Save As, no matter what the last folder we visited was, the folder that will show up in our Save As dialog is the same folder that the original file is located in. If we turn this option off, whenever you hit Save As, you go to the last folder that you opened in Photoshop. So it really depends on how you work best. In this training, we're going to leave this option on so that we always go back to the original folder whenever we choose Save As. But depending on your workflow, if you always want to be pointing to a particular folder and you don't want your Save As file to be grouped next to your original, you'd want to turn that off. Now this one down here, Ask Before Saving Layered TIFF Files, drives experienced Photoshop users absolutely nuts. We'll turn this off because with this checkbox on, you will get a dialog box every single time you go to save a TIFF file that has anything other than a background layer. Let's take a look at performance next. Now if you're on a Mac, this is a big deal. Photoshop CS5 is now a 64-bit application on the Mac operating system, meaning that you can access every last ounce of RAM installed on your computer. You can see here I've got almost 8.5 gigs of available RAM, and Photoshop would let me access pretty much all of it. Now it's a good idea to back off and leave enough RAM for your operating system and any other applications that you want to run. So somewhere between 65-75% is pretty good. But again, on a Mac, you can load up your machine with RAM and Photoshop can access as much of it as you designate with this slider. Windows users have had this capability in the last version of Photoshop, but for Mac users, this is a pretty big deal. Let's take a look at scratch disks. Now, if you're not familiar with what a scratch disk is, it's very important to understand this. When Photoshop runs out of memory, and no matter how much RAM you have available, if you start working with very large files, chances are at some point you'll run out of available memory. What the scratch disk does is designates a hard drive to function as sort of virtual RAM. If Photoshop runs out of physical RAM, it will use hard drive space for RAM. Now, this isn't going to be as fast as having more built-in RAM, but it's a great second option if you have a dedicated scratch drive. Now, by default, Photoshop selects your startup or boot drive as a scratch drive. You do not want to use your boot drive as a scratch disk. I have a separate hard drive called Scratch that I'm going to use instead, so I'm going to turn off my boot drive here. Now this is a separate dedicated hard drive that I do not store files on. This doesn't hold my iTunes collection. I don't save documents here. This is empty and it is only used by applications that need a scratch disk. So if you want to have a scratch disk, it's very important that you don't keep any files on it. You want to have a very fast hard drive here, because what we're doing is offering a substitute for physical RAM. When that runs out, Photoshop will point to here. And the faster the drive you have that's selected here, the faster your performance will be when you run out of actual built-in RAM. I'll point out that you do have to restart Photoshop in order for this scratch drive change to take effect. Here to the right on GPU settings, enable OpenGL drawing. This is something that CS5 takes advantage of to an even greater degree than CS4. So you want to enable this. Now, if this checkbox is grayed out, it means that your video card does not support this feature. Now, you can certainly still use Photoshop, but there will be certain features available that you won't be able to use. So if it is not grayed out, by all means, click on this checkbox, and we'll click on Advanced Settings. Now, depending on the video card you have installed, you may see Basic, Normal, and Advanced all selectable. My video card only supports the first two options, so I'm going to select Normal, which is the more powerful of the two, and hit OK. Finally, let's take a look at cursors. Now, we're going to leave these where they are, but I just want to explain a couple of things. If you ever find yourself on someone else's machine and you notice that your cursors are this same icon no matter what tool you have, you want to go into Preferences and make sure that it's set to Standard. Your standard cursor will show the icon of the tool you're in. So the Move tool, you'll see the Move tool icon. The eyedropper, you'll see the eyedropper icon. Okay, most people find it much more preferable to work that way so that they can see at a glance what tool they have selected. We have two brush tip options here, a normal and a full-size brush. Now I'm going to leave this set to normal brush tip, but if you want to be super duper precise, you can set full-size brush tip, and it will show you the full size of the brush so that your strokes would be contained almost completely within that circle. If we set it to normal brush tip, that's showing us in Photoshop where the bulk of our painting is going to happen, but there will be some spillover. We have the option to show crosshairs in either of these. Now that will give you the center of the brush, and some people find that a nice handy visual reference, but it's far from essential. I'm going to turn that off for this training. So we're just going to stick with a normal brush tip. And there we have it. We have set up our preferences. Now again, some of these are sort of personal choices, but the big performance-oriented ones we've really set up so that Photoshop can work in the most efficient manner. So we're just going to hit OK, and now we've got our preferences all set up, and we're ready to move on to the next level.